Dr. Hatcher, we are ready to begin.
Thank you, Alex. And good to have you back after your long departure there. Friends, I'm sorry to have a meeting on a feast night. I know that interferes with how many people can come, but if I had to schedule around all of the various holy days and feast nights and so on, it would be difficult to figure out when to record. So I'm relying on the fact that we are recording it so that those who aren't here tonight can benefit from whatever progress we make in this discussion of mysticism. We're going to spend tonight in at least one more class on this subject. We will spend, frankly, as much time as is needed. I mean, if we wanted to, we could spend a whole course on mysticism and the works of Bahá'u'lláh that are mystically oriented. So we're going to frame it in a kind of narrow perspective of those things where he is explicitly responding to Sufi mystics, because he, on the one hand, last week we discussed a number of things that are sort of antithetical to the Baha'i perspective in Sufism and in other mystic traditions of other religions. And we'll recount those tonight. At the same time, Baha'u'lláh had the greatest respect for them because they are very dedicated and are. The fact that they don't participate in large in society and see their own personal ascent as the principal objective of their lives means obviously that they're depriving the rest of us of what they have learned. So, I mean, that alone makes it a little bit of anathema insofar as the Baha'i concept of first knowing and then doing, and doing necessarily with virtues means interacting with others. It also interferes with the Baha'i principal objective of creating an ever-advancing civilization. Well, you can't do that if you're hiding away somewhere or if you are pursuing a solitary sense of internal development exclusive of your interaction with others. So that's pretty obvious why it would be problematic. But of course, Baha'u'lláh, for the 2 years he was in Kurdistan and his sojourn to where he ended up in Suleymaniye with other Sufis, they came to benefit from him and his knowledge. And indeed, the 7 Valleys, which we'll get into a little bit tonight, is a response almost to the work of Attar, another Sufi mystic, who wrote the Conference of the Birds, and we will discuss that too, which has the exact same valleys with the same names, but a little bit different approach insofar as not only what is accomplished, but in the end result. And so let's see if we can get to some of that. So let me share my screen, and we'll start with reviewing just in a couple of sentences what we did last time. So tonight we'll touch on mysticism in general, the 7 Valleys a little bit, though not in great depth. We'll do that next time. The concept of the friend, which becomes critical in this whole discussion. The concept of the friend is mentioned 12 different times in the 7 Valleys and in various other of the mystical works of Baha'u'lláh. And then the concept of annihilation, which sounds negative, except it's used in a positive way in the ascent of the mystic, where you have the annihilation of the self. It doesn't mean the annihilation of the essence of the self, but of selfishness, if you will. So the annihilation of your sense that you are different from or other than the totality of creation. But that's a very sophisticated concept, and we'll discuss it more. To repeat what I've said before, but a little more specifically, my objective in our discussion tonight in particular, but as we go through the works of Bahá'u'lláh, not ever in as much detail as I would like to, but as I think is wise to do so, and I'll appreciate your feedback if you want to go deeper into things than we're going. But my objective is to provide useful tools and personal observations, not to interpret the writings for you. So if you think I'm going to go through the seven valleys and tell you this means that, and this is alluding to this and so on, we don't have time to do that. And I don't think it would be wise if I did, because who's to say I'm right, or even if what I have to say might be helpful in your own reading. It's up to you to read with wisdom and with ardor, you know, to study. As I've always said, if you simply enter a classroom and you're taking notes on what the teacher has said, you're just going to, in effect, mimic what someone else has learned. You're not going to learn unless you do it yourself. It's an obvious axiom, but it's very important. Again, the main book we'll be using is the newly released translation of the Seven Valleys and the Four Valleys and some other mystical work, some of which we'll touch on, The Call of the Divine Beloved. And so last week, we touched on the principle that ecstasy is an effect of the mystic ascent or the mystic endeavor, not the goal, or should not be. And of course, what we discussed is that some students of Sufism believe that the ecstasy itself is what you're trying to attain, this sense of oneness with God, which is both an internal effect, but it has physiological, if you will, sensual experiences, which is nothing wrong with that as long as it doesn't stop with that. So we distinguished in that sense the difference between a mystic or a mystical experience versus mysticism as a way of life. So if the mystical experience, which probably all of you have had at one time or another, I hope you have. If not, I hope you will have, because it's a lovely experience, regardless of what degree of exaltation and nearness to God you feel, whether it's in a single prayer, a single moment, a sense of unity with others. It can derive from 1,000 things. But as we also discussed generally, and this is a broad generalization, but it's pretty accurate, most mysticism in most religions is antithetical to the organized religion. Now that may sound contradictory, but in other words, mysticism is not an authorized or recognized sect of a religion. It's an orientation towards a religion. So a Christian mystic may go to church, may not. Most of them did not. Most of them isolated themselves and so on, or they joined an organization of other mystics in fraternal orders where they would have absolute silence. They would have no socialization. So even within their own cadre of fellow mystics, they would not communicate, as if this was somehow would vitiate their experience. One of the things we're going to get to very heavily next week is this idea that socialization, or the social aspect of the mystical experience, is absolutely essential from a Baha'i point of view. Then we come to the concept of the friend or the beloved. No doubt you've come across this term in the Baha'i writings. And of course, the beloved usually alludes to Baha'u'lláh or the Bab, and the friend as it does as well. However, this term is used throughout Sufi mystical poetry, way back, hundreds of years, in some of the earliest, Rumi and his mentor, Shams of Tabriz. So even though, as we read last week, the Guardian says that all religion is fundamentally mystic in character, that's a distinction between the mystical aspect of all metaphysical studies, where we are acknowledging that, yes, we believe there is a God, we believe there is a metaphysical reality. And what's more important, we believe that there isn't, what my brother used the term, interpenetration between the two realms, by which he meant that we believe that we in the physical realm can have an influence on our spiritual well-being, even as those in the next world can pray for us and have an influence on this world. So there's this, if you will, this collaboration or complementarity between the two realms, both in our lives, because we're physical beings, and yet we're really spiritual beings operating through a physical or metaphorical construct. Now, we also dealt last time with Mirza Abul Fazl's observation, really a denigration of Platonism. Now, what he is objecting to, quite correctly, is what was done with Platonism, not what Plato or his mentor Socrates really meant. And this is the quote that we read last time. Indeed, if we consider the matter of the rise of monkhood in Christianity, and by that, as I said, he means both the friars, the monks, the various orders of monastic orders and so on, and Sufism in Islam, we readily understand that their origin was the Platonic philosophy, which it was, but it is I won't say an abuse of Platonism, but a misunderstanding or a misappropriation of Platonism. And we're going to see how that occurs tonight. Now, of course, we also read the contrary view of Platonism, or at least Socratic thought, which is the heart of Platonism. And this is Bahá'u'llah's lofty praise of Socrates. He it is who perceived a unique, a tempered, and a pervasive nature in things, bearing the closest likeness to the human spirit. And he discovered this nature to be distinct from the substance of things in their refined form, meaning it is metaphysical. In other words, everything emanates some aspect of spiritual attributes. So as we said last time, a stone has tenacity, a plant has growth and beauty and so on. So, and this is distinct, as he says, from the thing itself. And this is what Socrates saw, that behind the image was another reality, and behind that reality was a still higher reality, and that we're going to look at tonight. Another thing that you may be familiar with is Baha'u'llah's explanation of this concept in many different places, but this is one of the most obvious. Upon the inmost reality of each and every created thing, he hath shed the light of one of his names. And of course, his names mean his attributes, and made it a recipient of the glory of one of his attributes. And that's where he clarifies it. And so, in other words, this is what he is saying here about Socrates. Socrates understood that. All right. Now, here's something you may not know. Abdu'l-Baha says that Socrates got the seed of his understanding, the inspiration, if you will, from his philosophy, from visiting Jewish learned scholars in Israel. Even the celebrated philosophers of Greece journeyed to Jerusalem in order to study with the Israelite sages, Israelitish sages, and many were the lessons of philosophy and wisdom they received. Among these philosophers was the famous Socrates. He visited the Holy Land and studied with the prophets of Israel, acquiring principles of their philosophical teaching and a knowledge of their advanced arts and sciences. After his return to Greece, he founded the system known as the unity of God. And we're going to understand that tonight. And so this already segregates, if you will, Socrates from what the Sufis did and what the monastics did, such as Augustine and others, with Platonism. Because the end result of the ascent of learning the image behind the image and the reality behind the shadow and so on, the ultimate source, as we saw very briefly last time, is God. So Socrates was basically teaching monotheism in a society that was polytheistic, and therefore he was told to stop. He didn't, and so he was executed as a result of what they called perverting the youth with his strange ideas. So the concept of ascent in Plato, we're not going to go over this one particularly because it's really a replication in another analogy of an ascending line, though this one is horizontal, of a progress from imagination to belief to thought to understanding. And I'll show you how that works in the analogy of the cave, or the allegory of the cave. So this right here would be the realm of imagination. He thinks he's seeing something because he's chained to this wall, and all he can see is what's on the wall, the shadows on the wall. And these are the objects casting the image. And so they're not even seeing this thing here. They're seeing an image. It's imagination. And so one who is determined to find the truth, Socrates calls the philosopher king, because he is the one determined to find the truth behind the illusion of truth. And so he unbinds himself, unchains himself, which metaphorically, of course, means he loosens himself from traditions and ancient and outworn thoughts. He turns around and sees that, oh, even these things here are simply illusions. They are being paraded in front of this wall, but what makes them visible is a light. And so the philosopher king, who is fairly equivalent, if you will, to the manifestation. There are a few distinctions, but you can pretty well equate him in the Republic to the manifestation of God, and you won't be far afield of the truth. So he ascends with effort this rough-hewn wall and sees, oh, the fire is what's causing these things to be understood or to be seen. But then he climbs further and he realizes that beyond this fire is another light, the light of this reality. Now, in this image, you don't see what you do in several other images later that I will show you. We're not there yet. This image here, where you see that he goes, he is chained to the wall. He sees the reflection. He climbs up, he sees the object, he climbs up, he sees the fire making the image on the wall. So you've got 1 level, 2 level, 3 level. Then he climbs out into reality, but he's still, according to the description, it's very dramatic. It's a very interesting reading. The philosopher king, his eyes are so affected by the brightness of the sun that he can't look up. It hurts his eyes. So he said, look, all he can see is the ground, and he sees the reflection of a tree, and he thinks, oh, that's reality. But then as his eyes become accustomed to the brightness of reality, he sees that, oh, even this is a shadow or a reflection of reality, which is the tree. But then he goes another step, and this step is really 2 more steps. He sees the concept of tree. In other words, how does he know this is a tree? He learns that there is a concept or an attribute of treeness, if you will. But what makes treeness, what makes these attributes of, say, instead of treeness, we'll talk about justice or kindness. What makes them have some impact in the physical world is the sun itself. And the sun, which he calls the good, is really God, represents God. And so that's the motive, that all reality, if you will, emanates from God, creates these concepts. The concepts are made manifest in physical things, and those physical things cast shadows, and so on and so on. So this is an allegory. It's not to be taken literally. It's a poetic process of explaining how, as we are in this world bound by the traditions of our forefathers and so on, we can ascend different levels of understanding. And that's what the divided line is about here, from imagination to belief to thought to understanding. It's a more simplistic understanding. So as we go forward, then you can see that the basic concept of the philosopher king frees himself. But, and here's something that is not talked about by the Sufis, and what Mirza Abul Fazl would say, if you would look at this, you would realize that Plato is not getting at stopping with that realization and just basking in the union with the knowledge of God, the nearness to God. He says, there is a social imperative in Plato's allegory of the cave. Now, what's a social imperative? My book, The Ascent of Society, the social imperative in personal salvation, means that you cannot achieve salvation, though that term is really borrowed from Christianity and other works, so we don't really use it in the Baha'i faith. You can't really achieve belief without practicing your faith in social action. And so these, again, as we said last time, these twin duties of understanding and putting understanding into action are inseparable throughout the faith in so many different ways. We'll see it in the hidden words. We see it, of course, in the first paragraph of the Agdas, and we see it in the noonday prayer, to know thee and to worship thee. And so these are inseparable and reciprocal processes of knowledge and social action. So where is that in Plato's allegory of the cave? Well, Socrates says after he achieves this wonderful goal and this insight and this knowledge, it's his obligation to go then into the cave. It is his duty, once having glimpsed the good and having experienced nearness and knowledge of the totality of reality, and that should be just to descend into the cave and teach and coax those still constrained by the bounds of affection for the illusory appeal of material, it should be material reality, to loosen their bonds and follow him in ascending stage by stage into achieving ever more accurate, that should be ever and not every, more accurate and advanced stages of knowledge, and the attendant delight that results from individual and collective ascent. So it's one thing to feel exaltation and mystical ecstasy by yourself, but as you know, if you've been in a choir or study class, it's a heck of a lot more exalting and thrilling to feel it collectively and to know that you're with others who know what you are experiencing. Because the one thing you want when you have such an experience is to share it. And it's ineffable. It's beyond words, these experiences. But if you're with others who are experiencing, you don't have to use words because you can tell that they are experiencing the same thing. So there is a, if you will, a social imperative in Socrates that the Sufis and others who utilize this concept of ascent kind of leave out. Now, of course, you can see as being representative possibly of the manifestation, the philosopher kings are different from the manifestation ontologically, and that is the nature of their being, because the manifestations, as we know from the Baha'i writings, come into this life already knowledgeable. They don't need to strive and struggle, at least not in this life, to understand. So there is, of course, as we've said before in many classes, a social imperative in the Baha'i ascent. You've got the twin duties of recognition and action, the twin institutions of the learned and the rulers. And then I love this, the last hidden word, which is Persian word hidden too. After all the lofty axioms that Bahá'u'lláh has given us, which are the synthesis of all the essential spiritual verities from all the previous revelations, he ends up with this simple statement of the best of men are they that earn a livelihood by their calling and spend upon themselves and upon their kindred for the love of God, the Lord of all worlds. So isn't that incredible that the most important thing you can do is have an occupation, have a family, spend upon your loved ones and your kindred and so forth. In other words, live a good life. And we'll deal with that, as I say, more in the next class. So the basic concept then in all mystical thought is of ascent. And it's described differently in different works. Now, one of the most important modern, I say modern now, it's over 10 years old, but the most well-accepted basic description of what is mysticism is Fundamental Ascent in the Mystic Experience by Evelyn Underhill, called Practical Mysticism. That's the name of the book. The Fundamental Ascent, that's my title for the slide. And so I don't want to take time to go in her description of each of these, but you'll get a sense of what she's talking about. First, awakening of the spirit to the desire for ascent, the purgation of the things of this world, of getting rid of attachment to the things of this world. Illumination, and that's where you have some knowledge or insight into the reality behind the image of reality, what's really important other than the things that we cherish when we see how the rich and famous are doing in their wonderful abodes, and yet they still aren't happy. And we still don't get the point that there aren't any things that are going to make you feel this feeling that we're all after, which is ultimately the love of God, even though it's concealed in everything else we love. So you get some insight into the fact that it is the love of the spiritual essence that abides within things. Then the dark night of the soul, she describes. This is a term from, if you'll remember, we mentioned a couple of classes ago, the Ascent of Carmel, the work a Spanish mystic wrote. And this is where you start panicking, where you feel like you've got nothing left, that you've in effect, you're alone in this quest, and that you feel bereft of any consolation. But then you achieve union with the other. And the other is where we get into trouble in mysticism. What is the other? Well, the other in the case of Sufism is just a sense of union with the universe, or a sense of union possibly with God. In the case of Coleman Barks' interpretation of Rumi's work, it is a sense of union with his mentor, Shams of Tabriz. Now, we have, so that's the basic outline of most mystical thought, according to Underhill. Now, look how it compares to a work that was done by Attar, a Persian poet who wrote The Conference of the Birds, sometimes called the Simorgh. And we'll find out what the sea morgue is and why he calls it that. So in the story of the sea morgue, which we'll cover in just a second, these birds are challenged to go on a quest to find out who should be their monarch, who should lead them. But the wise Hopi bird tells them, if you want to find the abode of the sea morgue, you must go through this arduous journey of first the valley of quest, or searching, the valley of love, where you have a sense of attraction, if you will, the fragrance of the beloved. You go through the valley of knowledge, the valley of detachment, the valley of unity, the valley of wonderment, and finally the valley of poverty and annihilation. And here's the word annihilation again. Now, if that sounds familiar with you, you can see why, because this exactly the pattern that Bahá'u'lláh uses to explain what's right about mysticism and what's failing in it, because he uses the same concept of the valley of search, the valley of love, the valley of knowledge, the valley of unity, the valley of contentment, the valley of wonderment, and the valley of true poverty and absolute nothingness. Now, let's discuss just very briefly what he means by these. You can compare it to a love relationship if you want to, the various stages of a love relationship with an individual. That works to a certain extent. Or you can compare it to your own development as a believer, whether in the Baha'i faith or any other religion. First, you're searching. Now, what are you searching for? Well, you don't really know exactly, but you have to get some sense of it before you search, so you know what you're searching for. So if you're looking for a religion that'll tell you what you need to do every second of the day and where you don't have to think for yourself, then you may find a religion that's very rigorous and overbearing, where you don't do anything except what you're told to do. So you've got to know what you're searching for. And of course, what you're searching for from a Baha'i point of view is the truth, is the beloved, is the friend, is the image of God in all things. And when you sense that, you're attracted to that. And that's where you enter the valley of love, where you're just blindly attracted. You found something. In the case of becoming a Baha'i, for example, as I said before, it may be you visit the house of worship and you just sense this magnetic attraction. This is the place for me. Or you have a fireside where you're among the friends and you sense that, oh, these are the people I want to be with. It can be any number of experiences. The point is, it's not something you understand, it's something you feel. And interesting, Baha'u'lláh says, you've got to escape from this valley, because if you don't, the claws of the eagle of love will tear you to bits. In effect, you've got to go beyond this blind attraction and understand, why am I attracted? And so you go to the valley of knowledge, and that is, you study what it is that causes you to be attracted. And so, in effect, if you're studying the Baha'i faith, you study, well, what appeals to me about this? Well, there's a logical explanation for God's methodology of progressive revelation. There's the unity of religion. So all the religions now are there for the same purpose, and so on. You understand what I'm saying? You understand the logic underlying that which you are attracted to. Then once you go beyond this pure intellectuality of understanding, you sense a unity with what it is you have discovered. And this is sort of an ecstatic experience, as are the next four. So these are dealing with sort of material experiences, where these are ephemeral. These are totally spiritual conditions, a sense of unity, a sense of total contentment, of wonderment. And then, excuse me, I'm sorry, true poverty and absolute nothingness. And what is that about? Well, we're going to discuss it some more, but as I said before, is simply stated, it means that you don't, it's not self-abnegation, it's not denial of the self, it's not some sense of shame or something. You gleefully ignore wanting something for yourself and realize the, what shall I say, the wonderment, contentment, and sense of unity you feel by being part of an endeavor. Now, in this life, it might be part of putting together a community or the whole sense of the Baha'i faith as a global enterprise. It could be many things, but obviously there are degrees of this. And obviously you can't say, well, I'm at the stage number 3. So no, you go through these more than once. You could go through them all in a day. You could, but you may have to repeat going through them, and that's okay. But you get the sense of of the logic of this. Now, the difference, of course, is that the ultimate objective is not nothingness in the sense of annihilation that the Sufis are talking about, where you just don't exist, where you're sort of absorbed into the universe, or you return to God. Now, of course, we have that concept, don't we, on the burial ring? I came from God, and unto God shall I return. But it doesn't mean literally. It means that you came from a spirit, you emanated as a being of spirit, and you're returning to that realm, but not as a being without self, without identity, without what is called in sociology agency. You have will, and you have a job to do, and that will increase, and that never ceases. That's very important, because I've heard some talks by others who interpret this to mean that self, it's that's the same strange thing to say. Self itself disappears. No, you will always be an individual soul, the writings tell us, and you will always have your identity. But what you do is when you become powered as being a part of something, you don't care so much about distinguishing yourself from other selves. You take joy in being a part of this ongoing effort. All right. Coleman Barks, and again, please believe me, I have the greatest respect for Coleman. He's an incredible poet. He's done a beautiful job of interpreting or translating Rumi. But his understanding of the spiritual underpinning of some of it falls short of understanding that the concept of the friend is not referring to Shams of Tabriz. It's referring to Muhammad, or God as understood through Muhammad, because both Shams and Rumi were devout Muslims. And so the friend in the works of Rumi are referring maybe sometimes to Shams as an exemplar that has helped him discover God or understand God, but not as the end result. In other words, the end result of his quest is union with God. And that's a portrait of Shams. And I say the friend question mark, because is he the friend, or is he the one who helped lead Rumi to an understanding of who the friend is? Now, to underscore this, because it's tremendously important in the concept of mysticism, in the Seven Valleys, Bahá'u'lláh mentions the friend no fewer than 12 times. And so I've made one quote here from not the Seven Valleys, but the Tabernacle of Unity, because he uses the same phrase in various other works, and the Tabernacle of Unity is one of those works. Say, O ye that have eyes to see, the past is the mirror of the future. Gaze ye therein and be apprised thereof. Perchance you may be aided thereby to recognize the friend. In other words, in your search and as you research past history, you may recognize God at work in just what we've been trying to do for the last year in this course, in the Abrahamic religions, and each of them, or in the Dharmic religions, or any of the other religions. You get one of the great images Baha'u'lláh uses, olfactory images. You get the fragrance of the robe of the friend, and it's a good image that you just get a sense of his presence, and maybe not be the cause of his displeasure. In this day, the choicest fruit of the tree of knowledge is that which severeth the welfare of humanity and safeguardeth its interest. Serveth, not severeth, serveth the welfare of humanity. So here's here's an allusion to the friend in the seven valleys. The steed of this valley is patience. Without patience, the wayfarer on this journey will reach nowhere and attain no goal. Nor should he ever be downhearted. And of course, this is the valley of search. If he strive for 100,000 years and yet fail to behold the beauty of the friend, he should not falter. So there's a steed in each of the first, I think, 3 valleys. And the steed, of course, is that attribute or virtue you need to go through to traverse that valley. Here's another one from the 7 valleys. In this journey, the seeker reaches a stage wherein he seeth all created things wandering distracted in search of the friend. How many a Jacob will he see hunting after his Joseph? And of course, Jacob was the bereft father of Joseph, who was so upset when his favorite son, his youngest son, Joseph, was told by the brothers had been killed. He will behold many a lover hastening to seek the beloved. He will witness a world of desiring ones searching after the one desired. So, a few concluding thoughts for tonight. The stages of ascent, annihilation versus true poverty and absolute nothingness, I think I've covered pretty clearly. Annihilation, while interpreted literally by some mystics as meaning you return to God, quite literally. You emanated from God and you return to God, and in effect you sort of meld into this amorphous glump of spirituality. But not so. In the Baha'i writings, it is clear we retain our individuality, though we don't care as much about exerting our distinctiveness. This is one definition of annihilation from a mystic point of view: belief that union with or absorption into the deity or the absolute or the spiritual apprehension of knowledge inaccessible to the intellect may be attained through contemplation and self-surrender. Well, as long as you take that poetically, it's okay. But if you take it literally, you're lost. Some important terms we'll come across as we study Sufi poetry and other Sufi works: the friend or the beloved, the object of the quest, the wine or intoxication of the lover, the idea that your nearness induces in you a sense of intoxication is indicated often by images of imbibing wine. And the wine, of course, is the wine of the spirit. And the goblet is the retainer of that wine through which you imbibe it, and that's your capacity. And the choice wine, of course, is the spiritual influence itself. The cupbearer of the choice wine is the one who brings you the cup. That might be, for example, in the case of Ruby, Shams of Tabriz becomes the cupbearer of the choice wine. And then the tavern, that's not used a lot, but it's used in a few. It's used in some of the poems quoted by Bahá'u'lláh. And the tavern, of course, is, if not literal, but this is where the lovers gather to imbibe the choice wine. Now we get to, and we're going to finish up with the next 5 minutes or so, with a very brief look at the story of the Conference of the Birds by Attar of Nishapur, Farid And it's a very important work. In it, it goes like this. In the poem, the birds of the world gather to decide who is to be their sovereign, as they have done. The Hopi, the wisest of them all, suggest that they should find the legendary Simorg. And the Simorg is kind of like the phoenix in Persian mythology, the bird that arises from the ashes, a very mysterious bird. So they're going to find the Simorg and have the Simorg be their leader. The Hopi leads the birds, each of whom represents a human fault which prevents humankind from attaining enlightenment. The Hopi tells the birds that they have to cross 7 valleys in order to reach the abode of the Simorg. These valleys are as follows. I switched that around. You've already seen the valleys, the 7 valleys. They are equivalent to the same 7 valleys in the 7 valleys of Bahá'u'lláh. So here's the Hopi, the wisest of them all. And that's a real Hopi, isn't it? A beautiful thing, a strange looking bird. But as you can see in this painting, the Hopi is right here, sitting on the rock, telling them what to do. And they're all listening to the Hopi. But the birds aren't that enthusiastic when they hear they're going to suffer as they go through these valleys. The valley of here's the slide I should have had, the quest of love, knowledge, detachment, unity, wonderment, and poverty and absolute nothingness. When the birds hear the description of these valleys, they bow their heads in distress. Some even die of fright right then and there. But despite their trepidations, they begin the great journey. On the way, many perish of thirst, heat, or illness, while others fall prey to wild beasts, panic, and violence. Finally, only 30 birds make it to the abode of the Simorg. In the end, the birds learn that they themselves are the Simorg. They enter this abode and they look up, and before them is a mirror, because the word Simorg in Persian means 30 birds. Si, 30, morg means birds. Now, so what is the meaning of this? Eventually, and this is not my take on it, but this is the interpretation of it, they eventually come to understand that the majesty of that beloved is like the sun that can be seen reflected in a mirror. Yet whosoever looks in that mirror will also behold his or her own image. If Simorg unveils its face to you, you will find that all the birds, be they 30 or 40 or more, are but the shadows cast by that unveiling. What shadow is ever separated from its makers? Do you see? The shadow and its maker are one and the same. So get over surfaces and delve into mysteries. So what is problematic for me, and I'm not, maybe not to mystics and so on, but with this conclusion? And this is my own writing. What the birds see at the point where they reach the end of the long and challenging journey is none other than themselves. This presents the Sufi's full knowledge of himself spiritually and physically, but where is the friend? In other words, if they, in effect, have the power within themselves for self-rule, if you want to look at this as a political allegory, or if they themselves are God incarnate, then you have no sense of God as the beloved who is overseeing and ordaining the progress of humankind. And so it's kind of, if you will, circular logic as far as I'm concerned. Well, that's enough for tonight. We'll deal some more with it. Look, again, you can Google the Simorg and learn more about the Conference of the Birds. So let me stop here.